The camera opens on silence. A wide, slow-moving aerial shot of a capital city at dawn. Stone buildings. Empty streets. Flags hanging without wind. The voice enters calmly, without urgency, without emotion, as though history itself has begun to speak. In every age of power, there comes a moment when loyalty fractures. Not with noise. Not with spectacle. But with a quiet decision, made behind closed doors, by someone who once stood close enough to whisper into the ear of authority. This is the story of such a moment. Not of a single man, nor of a single nation, but of a pattern repeated across centuries. A betrayal that did not merely remove a ruler, but altered the course of history itself. One act that redefined power, reshaped institutions, and taught future leaders a brutal lesson, that the greatest threat to power rarely comes from enemies at the gates, but from allies within the palace. This documentary traces one political betrayal, its origins, its execution, and its consequences, across time. It examines how trust was broken, how systems collapsed, and how the echoes of that single decision still shape modern politics. The story begins long before the betrayal itself. Power is never static. It is negotiated daily, maintained through alliances, fear, reward, and belief. Every political order rests on an unspoken agreement, that those closest to power will protect it, not undermine it. In the years leading up to the betrayal, the state appeared strong. Its institutions were intact. Its leader commanded authority. Publicly, unity prevailed. Privately, however, cracks had begun to form. At the center of this system stood a ruler whose ascent had been swift. Charismatic. Strategic. Seen by supporters as a stabilizer after years of chaos. Seen by rivals as an obstacle too entrenched to remove openly. Around this ruler formed a tight inner circle, advisors, ministers, confidants. Men and women who had benefited from proximity to power. Who owed their careers, wealth, and protection to the system as it stood. Among them was one figure in particular. Not the most powerful. Not the most visible. But indispensable. A political operator. Trusted. Patient. Someone who understood both the mechanics of governance and the psychology of ambition. For years, this individual had served loyally, or appeared to. Sitting in meetings. Drafting strategies. Managing crises. Yet beneath this surface loyalty lay something more dangerous than opposition. Resentment mixed with opportunity. Political betrayals rarely begin with ideology. They begin with emotion. Marginalization. Fear of irrelevance. The slow realization that proximity to power does not guarantee succession. That loyalty does not always lead to legacy. As the ruler consolidated authority, power narrowed. Decisions became centralized. Old allies found themselves excluded from the future they believed they had helped build. This was the environment in which betrayal became conceivable. The moment of decision did not come suddenly. It arrived gradually, through a series of private calculations. A mental ledger balancing risk against reward. Survival against loyalty. Legacy against obedience. The betrayer began to imagine alternatives. What if the ruler were weakened, not overthrown outright, but exposed? What if a crisis could be manufactured or accelerated? What if rivals could be coordinated quietly, while public loyalty was maintained? This was not a revolution. It was a surgical strike against trust. The genius, and the danger, of political betrayal lies in its invisibility. Unlike coups or rebellions, betrayal operates within the system. It uses official channels. Legal procedures. Familiar faces. The betrayer did not act alone. Behind every great betrayal lies a network of silent beneficiaries. Foreign interests. Domestic rivals. Institutions eager to reclaim power lost to the executive. Meetings were held discreetly. Conversations framed as contingency planning. Language remained ambiguous, deniable. No explicit treason. Only preparation. What made the betrayal inevitable was timing. A crisis emerged. Economic pressure. Public unrest. External threat. The precise nature of the crisis mattered less than its effect. It created uncertainty. And uncertainty is the oxygen of conspiracies. As the ruler focused outward, attempting to stabilize the state, the inner circle began to shift inward. Loyalties realigned. Information was filtered. Critical warnings delayed or softened. The ruler remained unaware. Power isolates. The higher one climbs, the fewer truths reach the top unaltered. The betrayal unfolded not with gunfire, but with paperwork. A vote. A motion. A legal interpretation. An emergency clause invoked at the right moment. The betrayer stood publicly beside the ruler even as the mechanism of removal was set in motion. Speeches continued. Smiles remained. Appearances were maintained. Then, in a single day, the balance collapsed. The ruler was confronted not by enemies, but by institutions once loyal. Courts. Legislatures. Security services suddenly neutral, then hostile. The betrayal was complete not when the ruler lost office, but when support vanished instantly. No mass uprising. No dramatic confrontation. Only silence. By nightfall, the era had ended. History often treats such moments as inevitabilities, as though structures alone determined outcomes. But betrayal is a human act. It is choice. The consequences were immediate and profound. The removal of the ruler shattered the myth of invincibility. It taught future leaders that formal power could be undone from within. That charisma and popular support were insufficient against coordinated elite defection. Institutions, once bent to serve the executive, reasserted themselves, temporarily. The balance of power shifted. New actors rose. But the deeper impact was psychological. Trust evaporated from politics. From that moment onward, governance became paranoid. Leaders surrounded themselves with loyalists rather than competent administrators. Independent institutions were weakened preemptively. Dissent was equated with disloyalty. The state survived. But it changed. Political betrayal does not merely remove leaders. It transforms systems. The betrayer, meanwhile, did not inherit the future they imagined. History rarely rewards betrayal with stability. Though initially praised as a defender of legality or order, the betrayer soon became a symbol of mistrust. Allies wondered who might be next. Rivals saw a precedent worth replicating. Power fragmented. What followed was not renewal, but prolonged instability. Factionalism. Cycles of revenge masked as reform. Each new leader ruling with fear of the same fate. The betrayal had succeeded tactically, and failed strategically. It solved an immediate problem while creating a permanent one. Centuries later, the pattern repeats. From ancient empires to modern republics, from royal courts to parliamentary chambers, political betrayal remains one of the most powerful forces in history. It ends wars and starts others. It topples dynasties and destabilizes democracies. It teaches rulers to fear their shadows and allies to hedge their loyalty. The lesson is always the same. Power depends not only on strength, but on belief. And belief, once broken, is almost impossible to restore. As the camera returns to the empty streets of the capital, the voice speaks once more. History is not changed only by revolutions or invasions. Sometimes, it is changed by a single person deciding, quietly, that loyalty no longer serves them. And in that moment, everything that follows becomes inevitable. The story does not end with removal. History rarely concludes at the moment of collapse. It only changes rhythm. What followed the betrayal was not clarity, but confusion, an extended aftermath in which the consequences unfolded slowly, often invisibly, shaping generations who would never know the original ruler, yet would live inside the system the betrayal created. In the weeks after the fall, the state attempted to restore normalcy. New faces appeared at podiums. Statements emphasized continuity, legality, stability. The language of reassurance dominated official communication. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. The old order had been broken not by force, but by consent withdrawn from within. This created a dangerous precedent, that power was conditional not on the will of the people alone, nor on law alone, but on elite alignment. Once that realization took hold, politics became a game of anticipation rather than governance. Every decision was now measured not by its merit, but by how it might be interpreted by potential betrayers. The state entered an age of defensive politics. The institutions that had enabled the betrayal quickly discovered the limits of their victory. Courts that had asserted independence now faced pressure to choose sides. Legislatures that had reclaimed authority became battlegrounds for factional warfare. Security services, once neutral arbiters, were scrutinized for loyalty rather than professionalism. What had appeared as a restoration of balance gradually became a redistribution of fear. No faction trusted another fully. Coalition replaced coherence. Governance slowed as consensus became fragile and temporary. The public, meanwhile, experienced betrayal differently. For many, the removal of the ruler felt abrupt, incomprehensible. Supporters saw injustice. Opponents saw vindication. Most saw uncertainty. The narrative fractured along ideological, regional, and social lines. Truth became contested. In this environment, myth began to replace memory. The fallen ruler was reimagined, by some as a martyr, by others as a tyrant narrowly escaped. The betrayer was portrayed alternately as a patriot or a traitor. History hardened into competing stories, each serving present political needs. This was perhaps the betrayal's most lasting effect, the collapse of a shared narrative. Years passed. New leaders emerged, each promising reform, unity, and renewal. Each entered office aware of the silent rule now governing power: trust no one fully, especially those closest to you. Cabinets grew smaller. Advisors were chosen for loyalty rather than dissenting insight. Decision-making became centralized again, not out of ambition, but out of fear. Ironically, the system drifted back toward the very concentration of power that had provoked the original betrayal. This is the paradox of political betrayal. It destroys authority in the short term, but encourages authoritarian instincts in the long term. Leaders who learn from betrayal do not learn openness. They learn control. Beyond the borders of the state, observers took note. Foreign governments studied the event carefully. Analysts dissected timelines, votes, statements, silences. Intelligence agencies added a new case study to their archives. The lesson was clear: influence over inner circles mattered more than pressure from outside. Diplomacy shifted focus from public leadership to private networks. Power became something to be cultivated quietly, indirectly. The betrayal changed not only domestic politics, but international strategy. Allies recalibrated. Adversaries adjusted. The state's credibility altered, not because of policy, but because of perceived internal fragility. From that point on, every crisis, economic, military, diplomatic, was interpreted through the lens of potential internal fracture. The betrayer themselves faded from prominence over time. Their name remained in textbooks and debates, but their influence diminished. They became a symbol rather than a force. Their intentions endlessly debated, their motives permanently ambiguous. History offered no final verdict. Instead, it offered a warning. Betrayal grants power only briefly. Its true legacy is suspicion. Generations later, historians would argue about inevitability. Was the betrayal unavoidable? Was the ruler doomed by structural forces? Could reform have prevented the fracture? Could trust have been rebuilt? There is no definitive answer. What is certain is this: once betrayal becomes a successful method of political change, it enters the repertoire of power. It becomes an option. And once it becomes an option, it will be used again. The camera shifts now, not to a single place, but across time. Ancient courts. Medieval councils. Revolutionary assemblies. Modern parliaments. Different eras. Different systems. The same dynamic. An inner circle. A leader. A moment of doubt. A choice. History turns not on the loudest voices, but on the quietest decisions. The narrator speaks with measured calm. Political systems do not fall because they are attacked. They fall because they are abandoned. Abandoned by those entrusted to uphold them. As the final images linger, empty chambers, closed doors, faded portraits, the truth settles in. Betrayal does not merely change who rules. It changes how ruling is done forever. And once that line is crossed, no system ever fully returns to innocence. The screen fades to black. Silence. Then a final line appears. Power remembers betrayal longer than it remembers justice. The silence does not signal an ending. It signals distance. Distance between the event and its consequences. Between the decision and its full cost. Between the moment of betrayal and the slow transformation it imposed on history. In the decades that followed, the state carried the betrayal like an unspoken trauma. Official anniversaries marked victories and reforms, but never the fracture itself. It was referenced indirectly, euphemistically, as a transition, a correction, a necessary intervention. Language was carefully chosen. Betrayal, after all, is a word that assigns responsibility. And responsibility was something no faction wished to fully claim. The generation that came of age after the betrayal inherited a political culture shaped by caution. They did not remember the ruler who fell, only the instability that followed. For them, loyalty was not a virtue but a risk. Commitment was temporary. Alliances were conditional. Politics became transactional. Every coalition carried an expiration date. Every promise included an escape clause. Ideology gave way to positioning. Conviction yielded to calculation. This was not cynicism. It was adaptation. In a system where betrayal had succeeded, survival required flexibility. Institutions adapted as well. Legal frameworks were revised to prevent the concentration of power that had preceded the fall. Term limits were strengthened. Oversight mechanisms expanded. Committees multiplied. On paper, the state appeared more resilient than ever. In practice, paralysis set in. Fear of dominance produced fragmentation. Fragmentation produced indecision. And indecision created openings for informal power to flourish. Where authority weakened, influence replaced it. Business elites, security figures, and media actors stepped into the vacuum. Power drifted away from visible institutions and into networks beyond formal accountability. The betrayal had not democratized power. It had dispersed it into shadows. Public faith eroded slowly. Citizens participated in elections, debates, protests. The rituals of democracy continued. But belief diminished. Not belief in individuals, but belief in permanence. No leader seemed secure. No policy seemed lasting. Every reform felt provisional. History had taught the public a lesson as well, that politics was reversible, fragile, contingent on deals they would never see. This awareness bred disengagement in some, radicalization in others. Extremes flourished where trust collapsed. From the perspective of history, the betrayal marked a transition not of leadership, but of political imagination. Before it, power was seen as something to be captured and exercised. After it, power was seen as something to be survived. The ambition of politics narrowed. Statesmen became managers. Visionaries became tacticians. Long-term projects were avoided in favor of short-term stability. The future shrank. Yet the betrayal's influence extended far beyond this single state. Other nations observed closely. Some drew inspiration. They learned that removing a leader need not involve tanks or crowds. That legitimacy could be manufactured after the fact. That legalism could be weaponized as effectively as force. Others drew caution. They reinforced executive power. Neutralized inner circles. Purged ambiguity. They chose repression over vulnerability. In both cases, the betrayal reshaped global political behavior. It taught the world that modern power could be undone quietly. Historians would later debate whether this moment represented progress or regression. Some argued it proved institutions mattered more than individuals. That no leader should be indispensable. That accountability, however disruptive, was necessary. Others argued the opposite. They saw the betrayal as the moment trust collapsed permanently. As the point where politics became procedural rather than principled. Where loyalty was replaced by opportunism. Both interpretations contain truth. History rarely offers clean verdicts. What cannot be disputed is scale. The betrayal altered constitutional norms. It changed elite behavior. It redefined political risk. It reshaped how future leaders governed and how future challengers plotted. All from a single decision. A choice made in confidence, by someone who believed history would understand. History did not. It remembered the act, not the intention. The camera returns once more to corridors of power. Doors closing. Lights dimming. Voices lowered. These are the spaces where history is truly made. Not in public squares, but in rooms where trust is tested and loyalty weighed against ambition. The narrator speaks one final time, steady and restrained. Every political system eventually faces a moment when loyalty and interest diverge. How that moment is resolved determines not only who rules next, but how power itself will function for generations. Betrayal is never just an ending. It is a blueprint. And once history draws that blueprint, it is copied again and again. Only the quiet understanding that somewhere, even now, another decision is being made. The blueprint does not remain theoretical. Over time, it becomes instinct. Political actors who grew up under the shadow of the betrayal no longer needed to study it. They absorbed it intuitively. It shaped how they read silences in meetings, how they interpreted praise, how they treated loyalty as something provisional rather than absolute. In this environment, power became hyper-aware of itself. Every appointment was scrutinized not for competence alone, but for future risk. Every rising figure was assessed not by what they could do now, but by what they might do later. Politics became preemptive. Potential betrayals were neutralized before they could form. This did not produce stability. It produced tension frozen in place. The state's political language evolved. Words like unity, reform, and consensus remained in circulation, but their meaning shifted. Unity no longer meant shared purpose, it meant temporary alignment. Reform no longer meant transformation, it meant adjustment without disruption. Consensus meant delay. Public speeches grew cautious. Leaders avoided grand promises. Vision was replaced with reassurance. History had made ambition dangerous. Behind the scenes, informal rituals emerged. Leaders demanded personal loyalty rituals, private affirmations, informal pledges, symbolic gestures. Trust became personal rather than institutional. This further weakened the system. Institutions were no longer trusted to ensure loyalty. People were. And people, unlike systems, could change their minds. The irony deepened. The betrayal that was justified as a defense of institutions ultimately undermined institutional authority more thoroughly than the fallen ruler ever had. The economy felt the shift. Long-term investments hesitated. Policy reversals became common. Strategic industries suffered from uncertainty as leadership turnover accelerated. Each new administration reviewed the decisions of the last, not to improve them, but to protect itself from future accusations. Economic planning shortened its horizon. Investors, domestic and foreign, learned to wait. Uncertainty became structural. Culturally, the betrayal seeped into art, literature, and media. Writers explored themes of loyalty and duplicity. Films depicted leaders undone by those closest to them. Popular narratives no longer centered on heroic opposition, but on internal collapse. The villain was no longer the outsider. It was the confidant. Society internalized the lesson. Trust was dangerous. Proximity was risky. Power corrupted not only those who held it, but those who touched it. As decades passed, the betrayal lost specificity. Names faded. Dates blurred. But the instinct remained. Young politicians entering public life were warned indirectly. Not through history lessons, but through advice. Be careful who you trust. Never show all your cards. Keep your circle small. These warnings were offered as wisdom, not fear. The betrayal had become normalized. At certain moments, reformers tried to reverse the damage. They spoke of transparency, institutional trust, depersonalized power. They attempted to rebuild norms rather than enforce control. Some succeeded briefly. But the memory of the betrayal always returned at the first sign of crisis. A rumor. A leaked document. A sudden resignation. Old reflexes reactivated. Trust collapsed faster than it could be rebuilt. From a historical distance, this is how one betrayal reshapes time. Not through dramatic rupture alone, but through repetition of its logic. Through the habits it creates. Through the limits it imposes on imagination. The state did not fall. But it never fully rose again. Comparative historians would later identify this moment as a turning point. Before it, political change had been turbulent but directional. After it, change became circular. Power rotated, but structures remained anxious and brittle. Leadership cycles shortened. Institutional memory weakened. Governance became reactive. History slowed. The narrator's voice returns, measured and unembellished. Political betrayal is often defended as realism. As necessity. As correction. As inevitability. But history records something else. It records what is lost. The loss of trust as a governing principle. The loss of continuity as a political value. The loss of faith that power can be transferred without fear. These losses compound. They do not announce themselves. They accumulate quietly. The final images do not show collapse. They show endurance. A parliament still meeting. Courts still issuing rulings. Elections still held. Outwardly, the system functions. Inwardly, it remembers. And memory, in politics, is power. The screen holds on an empty chair at the center of a grand chamber. Once occupied. Once protected. Once betrayed. Time moves forward, but the system does not forget. As years turn into generations, the betrayal becomes embedded not as an event, but as an assumption. A silent rule governing behavior across the political class. It no longer needs to be spoken aloud. It is understood. Those who rise fastest are those who reveal least. Political apprentices learn early that visibility attracts danger. That clarity invites challenge. That trust creates leverage for others. Ambiguity becomes a shield. Silence becomes strategy. The betrayal has taught them this. Political education changes shape. Where earlier generations studied ideology, law, or governance, the new generation studies alignment. They analyze who stands behind whom. Who benefits from which silence. Who is excluded from which meeting. Power is read between the lines. This produces leaders who are tactically gifted but strategically hollow. They know how to survive moments, but not how to shape eras. History becomes something to manage, not to make. The security apparatus evolves next. Not outwardly, but internally. Its primary task shifts from defending the state to monitoring loyalty within it. Information flows inward rather than outward. Surveillance turns subtle, administrative, procedural. Not to prevent coups. To prevent betrayal from being organized too effectively. The irony is complete. A betrayal justified as a defense of legality now produces a permanent suspicion toward legal processes themselves. Public discourse grows thinner. Debate becomes performative. Real negotiation moves offstage. Press conferences deliver certainty where none exists. Journalists sense the limits, even when they are not stated. Questions remain unanswered. Not because answers are unknown, but because they are unsafe. Citizens feel this gap instinctively. Participation continues, but enthusiasm fades. Politics becomes distant, technical, drained of meaning. The betrayal has not silenced the public. It has exhausted it. At moments of crisis, the old wound reopens. An economic downturn. A security failure. A constitutional dispute. Each time, the same question hangs unspoken in the air: who will betray whom first? All actors behave accordingly. All outcomes narrow. Historians looking back centuries later will struggle to explain why the state never fully recovered its confidence. They will chart policies, reforms, and leadership changes. They will note progress in some areas, stagnation in others. They will argue over causes. But beneath all analysis lies a simpler truth. The betrayal taught the system to fear itself. The camera drifts now through archives. Documents stacked in quiet rooms. Transcripts of meetings never meant to be public. Margins marked with hesitation. These are the fossils of decision-making. They show how often leaders paused. How frequently plans were abandoned. How rarely trust was extended without contingency. The betrayal is there, on every page, even when it is not named. In comparative perspective, the pattern becomes unmistakable. States that experience foundational betrayal do not collapse immediately. They endure. Sometimes they even thrive for a time. But they do so defensively. Their politics lack generosity. Their leadership lacks confidence. Their institutions lack mutual faith. They survive by limiting damage, not by expanding possibility. The narrator's voice returns, quieter now, but unchanged in tone. History often celebrates those who break systems in the name of correction. It speaks less about what happens afterward. The long years of caution. The shrinking of ambition. The permanent rehearsal for crisis. These are harder to dramatize. But they are the true legacy. In the final movement of this story, the focus returns to the individual. Not the ruler. Not the betrayer. But the countless officials, citizens, and leaders who came after. None of them chose the betrayal. All of them lived with it. This is how history really changes. Not through singular acts alone, but through the behaviors those acts normalize. The camera settles on a new generation entering the halls of power. They walk the same corridors. Sit in the same chambers. Speak the same ceremonial words. But the space feels different. Heavier. More guarded. Less hopeful. They inherit a system that functions, but does not trust itself. A system shaped not by collapse, but by fracture. The final narration unfolds slowly. Political betrayal does not end with the fall of a leader. It begins there. It teaches future generations what is possible, what is permissible, what is dangerous. And once that lesson is learned, history does not unlearn it. No conclusion. Only continuation. The continuation is quieter, slower, and more difficult to see. History, at this stage, no longer moves in sharp turns. It drifts. The political system that emerged after the betrayal develops a distinct rhythm, predictable, cautious, restrained. Change occurs, but always within narrow boundaries. Leaders rotate, slogans evolve, but the underlying behavior remains fixed. No one wants to be remembered as the one who trusted too much. Over time, an unwritten hierarchy forms. Not of offices, but of access. Those closest to real power are not those with titles, but those who control timing, information, and sequencing. Who knows what first? Who delays what slightly? Who frames events before others can react? This is the afterlife of betrayal. Power becomes temporal rather than positional. The ability to act first, or to make others act too late, matters more than authority itself. Decision-making becomes layered with redundancy. No single actor is allowed to be decisive. Committees review committees. Advisors counter advisors. Every major move is diffused across enough hands that responsibility becomes untraceable. This is not inefficiency by accident. It is inefficiency by design. When betrayal is feared, accountability becomes dangerous. The political culture adapts again. Praise becomes exaggerated but meaningless. Criticism becomes indirect and delayed. Loyalty is signaled constantly, loudly, and repetitively, not because it is felt, but because its absence would be noticed. The system speaks in assurances it does not believe. Everyone understands the performance. At the edges of this system, new political actors emerge. They present themselves as outsiders, reformers, disruptors. They promise to restore trust, clarity, and purpose. They speak openly about courage and conviction. For a moment, they excite the public. But the system absorbs them. To survive, they learn the same rules. They reduce their language. They narrow their circle. They adapt their promises to what is safe. Those who refuse are removed, not dramatically, but procedurally. Investigations. Delays. Technical disqualifications. The betrayal has taught the system how to neutralize risk without spectacle. The past ruler, long gone, becomes a reference point rather than a memory. Invoked selectively. Interpreted endlessly. Never fully confronted. Official history treats the period cautiously, focusing on structural lessons rather than moral ones. Education emphasizes complexity, balance, and institutional safeguards. What it avoids is trust. Trust is presented as naive. Suspicion as wisdom. Outside observers often misunderstand this stage. They see stability and assume health. They see continuity and assume resolution. But historians know better. This is what unresolved trauma looks like at the level of the state. Functioning. Alert. Unable to relax. At moments, there are glimpses of what was lost. A rare speech that dares to imagine long-term futures. A coalition formed on principle rather than necessity. An institution that briefly asserts independence without calculation. These moments are noted, even admired. Then quietly contained. The system is not cruel. It is cautious. As the decades accumulate, the betrayal fades further into abstraction. But its logic becomes permanent. It teaches that loyalty is conditional. That power is temporary. That proximity is dangerous. That systems protect themselves, not ideals. These lessons shape everything that follows. The narrator returns, voice unchanged. History often asks who betrayed whom. It asks less often what betrayal teaches those who come after. The answer is simple, and devastating. It teaches restraint over vision. Survival over progress. Control over trust. The final images do not resolve. They repeat. New leaders taking oaths. New alliances forming. New crises emerging. All within the same invisible limits. The system continues. History continues. But something fundamental remains closed. A door that was once opened by trust, and closed by betrayal. And once closed, it is never opened the same way again. Fade to black. The story does not end. It persists. The persistence of the story reveals itself most clearly at the margins. Not in the speeches of leaders or the language of law, but in the small, almost invisible choices made every day. A memo not sent. A meeting postponed. A recommendation softened. A warning delivered too late to be useful, but early enough to claim it was given. These are not accidents. They are habits learned in the shadow of betrayal. Within the bureaucracy, careers are shaped less by achievement than by avoidance. The safest path is to be indispensable but invisible. To know much, say little, and commit to nothing irreversible. Innovation becomes risky. Initiative becomes exposure. The system rewards those who leave no trace. Political memory grows selective. Archives exist, but access narrows. Records are preserved, but context fades. The betrayal is no longer denied, yet it is never fully examined. It becomes something everyone knows, but no one studies too closely. Because close study would require assigning responsibility. And responsibility threatens equilibrium. Over time, the meaning of legitimacy changes. It is no longer derived primarily from public trust or moral authority, but from procedural correctness. If the steps are followed, the outcome is accepted, even if belief is absent. Legitimacy becomes technical. This is how systems survive without conviction. The public senses this shift. Elections are contested not over visions of the future, but over interpretations of rules. Campaigns emphasize competence, experience, and stability. Words like change are used cautiously, often qualified, rarely explained. Hope becomes suspicious. Urgency becomes alarming. The betrayal has trained society to associate speed with danger. At the highest levels of power, leaders become archivists of their own survival. They document conversations. Record meetings. Preserve plausible deniability. Not because they expect betrayal, but because they expect its possibility. Every relationship contains an exit strategy. Comparative historians begin to notice a pattern. States marked by formative betrayal share similar traits decades later. Long tenures punctuated by sudden removals. Weak opposition but strong intrigue. Institutional continuity paired with moral exhaustion. They do not collapse dramatically. They erode quietly. At times, external shocks force the system to act. A war. A global crisis. A technological disruption. In these moments, the old caution proves costly. Delayed decisions compound damage. Fragmented authority struggles to respond decisively. Critics emerge, arguing that fear of betrayal has paralyzed leadership. They are not wrong. But they are not listened to for long. Because the system remembers a different lesson. That decisive power, once consolidated, may never be safely removed. And so the cycle tightens. Fear of dominance produces fragmentation. Fragmentation produces weakness. Weakness invites crisis. Crisis tempts consolidation. The memory of betrayal hovers over every choice. The narrator's voice returns, steady and unadorned. History is often described as a sequence of events. But sometimes, it is better understood as a sequence of lessons. The most enduring lessons are not taught intentionally. They are learned through pain. The betrayal taught a generation how to remove a leader. But it taught every generation after how to live without trust. That is the deeper change. Not visible on timelines. Not recorded in laws. But present in every calculation. The camera lingers on an empty council chamber once more. The chairs are arranged. The microphones tested. The procedures intact. Everything is ready for governance. Except belief. Fade slowly. The story continues, not forward, but inward.